Now therefore be it resolved that because the sale and the exploitation of human beings as chattel was sanctioned and perpetrated or perpetuated through the ordinances of the Savannah City Government, we acknowledge the complicity of the city government for slavery, its injustice, cruelty, and brutality practiced in Savannah through the adoption of ordinances by the Savannah City Council. Although this City Council cannot erase these inhumane injustices, this resolution provides for the record an acknowledgement of a dark chapter in the history of Savannah and a call to promote healing and reconciliation for all our citizens as we move forward in creating a better community.
City Council minutes, Thursday, November 30th, 1842. The Marshal reported that in obedience to a resolution passed for the sale of the Negro man London, the property of the corporation, he was sold on Tuesday last for $252. My name is Lacey Brooks, and I am a recent graduate of Armstrong Atlantic State University's Public History Master's Program. And I just completed a professional internship with the Research Library and Municipal Archives. I created a program called Municipal Slavery from records that I researched with the library. Municipal slavery is the city owning slaves, enslaved people, purchasing them to work within departments to do repairs or any other maintenance that needs to be done for public works. And that's the difference, rather than a private individual owning a person to do private work. The items that I researched from were treasury records, basically payee and a payor, and very unemotional information. It becomes emotional when you look at it at a later date, but just to look at it written, it's in and out information on a ledger. And then the City Council minutes are just minutes of the actual things that were said or done within the council meeting. But there's no emotion, there's no feeling of how an individual was thinking, what an individual is thinking or feeling for that particular event. So that it is more detached in that respect, not knowing what they were thinking when they were doing it and what their motive sometimes was behind it. Most of the treasury records that I pulled from came from this section. They are cash books, different volumes, the annual settlement statements. Unfortunately, some records have been lost to time. And some of the other volumes that are cash books are from here as well. The cash books are used to show cash in, cash out payments that are made to individuals or payments that are made from individuals. And so traditionally, a cash book is set up, the left side are your debits, the right side are your credits. Not every treasurer kept the records in the same manner, so that did make research a little bit difficult, but for the most part they were consistent. My background is actually in accounting, and so I tried to take that information that I already had to locate records that I felt were most likely to have purchases of enslaved people. I do think it is a little bit like peeling back layers in a forensic manner. That part is very exciting because it's a hunt. You're looking for a record that maybe somebody else hasn't found or that you can scan and provide access to.
My name is Luciana Spraker, and I'm Director of the City of Savannah's Research Library and Municipal Archives Department. Back in 2007, a question arose from the public about what was the city's role in the institution of slavery. How had we participated in slavery? And so there was a research project done at that time, very fast kind of reactive research project, looking at our records, both records in the library and archives here and those that are held by the Clerk of Council, including City Council minutes. And we really looked at three themes came out of that. One, that the city did own slaves and used them to support municipal work. Two, that the city generated revenue by taxing their citizens on their property, which included slaves. And three, that we controlled or tried to control slaves and free persons of color through local laws and ordinances. So in 2007, we put together an online research project that sort of tracked this involvement, and the City Council at that time passed a resolution that acknowledged, yes, that the city had participated in slavery. This was a period of Savannah's history.
Whereas over 4 million Africans and their descendants were held in involuntary servitude in the United States and the 13 colonies between 1619 and 1865, and whereas Africans and people of color were considered property and not equal citizens, although slave labor was the backbone of the economic base of Savannah and Georgia, and whereas Georgia followed Virginia as the second largest slaveholder with an estimated 462,198 slaves, more than the general population of the state, and whereas there was slavery in Savannah long before city government was created in 1789, and whereas historical records reveal that the Savannah City Council enacted slave ordinances, purchased slaves, and oversaw the use of slave labor for public.
This is a bill of sale for an enslaved individual named Alec, a man, that the city purchased from a woman named Sarah Cope in 1864. So very late in the Civil War, we made this purchase. The bill of sale shows that we paid $4,500 for it. It doesn't indicate that these were in fact Confederate dollars, but at that time period that would be an obvious conclusion that it was $4,500 in Confederate currency, using a currency calculator that shows that really we paid about $225 for Alec. This bill of sale was discovered in the records of the City Council. We have a group of papers called the City Council meeting papers, and they back up the City Council minutes. So these are a lot of the papers and petitions that City Council looked at and considered when they were making their final decisions within the meeting. So this is the actual city's copy of the bill of sale. There should be an official copy that is on file with the Superior Court at Chatham County, because all property transactions within Chatham County are actually a county record. So on this side you can see just the details, Sarah Cope to the mayor and alderman of the city of Savannah. Bill of sale of slave Alec for the consideration of $4,500. When you turn over to the inside, then there's the actual document that outlines the actual transaction, and it's very similar to a property deed for a piece of real estate, because unfortunately these individuals were considered property, so transactions for them were handled much in the same way that we would sell a piece of real estate property today.
Primarily the slaves that were purchased for the city were working in the department called the Scavengers Department, and these men removed debris, picked up items, did repairs around the city, helping keep the squares and streets clean of any obstructions and refuse, things like that. They called them scavengers because they had a cart and mule, and they went around to just randomly pick up where things were left behind by people that lived in the city. There was no garbage collection like we have today, and so these men went out and did that. I have no knowledge of how the men lived or how well they were taken care of. I do know that medical supplies were purchased, doctors were provided, clothing was provided. Where they actually lived, I was never actually able to definitively say. I do know that dwellings were created for the city pound, a location that is behind Colonial Cemetery originally was the city pound. And I do know that dwellings were created for the scavengers department lot, the scavengers lot, which was off of Boundary Street. But I was not able to actually determine whether anyone actually lived there.
An often misconception in Savannah is that slavery was banned from day one in the colony of Georgia, and that's actually not the case. When King George II issued the charter for the colony of Georgia, there was no mention of slavery in it. There was no, we are going to have slavery or we're not going to have slavery. When General James Edward Oglethorpe came over with the first round of colonists, they did not come with slaves, but they did utilize slave labor. They borrowed slaves from colonists in South Carolina to help them clear the land and build the first houses. And it's well documented in Oglethorpe's letters back to the trustees in England that there were Negroes, he referred to them as Negro slaves, that were helping them get the colony started. So this is in 1733, slaves were helping to start the colony of Georgia and the first settlement in that colony, which is Savannah. Now by 1735, Oglethorpe is starting to believe that colonists are becoming idle and lazy because they have the use of enslaved people to help them with their work. And he really discourages having slavery in the colony because he wants the white colonists to, do their own work and clear their land and do their own crops. So he proposes to banish slavery in the colony of Georgia. And one of the arguments that he uses is that having slavery in the colony of Georgia makes us vulnerable to foreign enemies. And you have to remember at that time we're on the border with Spanish Florida, and that was a real threat to us. And so the belief was that if we had slaves, foreign enemies could use them to, get them to insurrect against the English leadership, and so they felt that that was a risk, too much of a risk. So they were able in 1735 through an act signed by the king to banish slavery and the institution of slavery in Georgia. So from 1735 until 1750, just a period of 15 years, slavery was against the law in Georgia. However, during that period, the colonists in Georgia, complained a lot that they were at a disadvantage to the other British colonies like nearby South Carolina. They didn't have the labor to help them really get the agriculture going and help them grow their crops and be really profitable like South Carolina. And so they really pushed to have that ban lifted. And on January 1st, 1750, through an act that repealed that 1735 act, the slavery was allowed in Georgia. One interesting thing that came out in the project was the city took possession of 51 Africans from the slave ship Antelope. So it was interesting to learn how we were involved in what really is a very large international court case. The slave ship Antelope involved Spanish and Portuguese interests, and so it was a 7-year court case, and these Africans these that were captured as slaves and brought to this continent were really trapped in the middle of this court case.
My name is Jonathan M. Bryant. I'm professor of history at Georgia Southern University and author of the book Dark Places of the Earth, The Voyage of the Slave Ship Antelope. I joke with people, I say this is the most important Supreme Court case you've never heard of. The Antelope was a Spanish slave trader out of Havana, Cuba, that traveled to the coast of Africa. There it was captured by a privateer. They loaded 331 captives on board the two ships and set off for Brazil. A man named John Smith, who was commanding the Antelope, continued on hoping to find a market for these people. This was 1820. France, Holland, the United States, and Great Britain had all outlawed the international slave trade, so finding a market proved more difficult probably than Smith ever imagined. He tried in Suriname, he tried in St. Martin, he tried in St. Bart's, and ultimately the Antelope was captured by a United States revenue cutter off the coast of Amelia Island, Florida. The crew of the Antelope were brought to Savannah, in fact landed at Bolton's Wharf, and put in Savannah City Jail, charged with piracy. The Antelope itself was then brought to Savannah, and by this time the number of captives had been reduced to 258. The mortality is truly horrific. Even more horrific was what the city discovered when the captives disembarked from the Antelope here in Savannah. They were children. The average age of the 258 living captives at this moment was probably less than 14. They were so sick, so dehydrated, so ill that the marshal's intention that they would march from their landing out to the Savannah horse racing track, which is about 2 miles west of the city, wasn't going to work. These captives couldn't march anywhere. He had to hire a teamster, a guy named William Richardson, to transport the sickest to the racetrack. And there, living in what was dubbed the African encampment, these captives began what turned into an incredibly long wait. In August, the city decided that why not make use of this potential resource that's living right on the outskirts of Savannah. City Council on August 9th passed a resolution to take 50 of these captives and put them to work. One of the main problems that Savannah had encountered during the War of 1812, and actually in the year 1814, fortifications had been thrown up around the city. In essence, ditches and redoubts dug up quickly, piled around the city, and these fortifications still existed in 1820 and were now in the way of the expansive growth that the city had gone through after 1815. So 50 of the fittest Antelope captives were taken by the city of Savannah, put under the charge of the same William Richardson who transported them to the racetrack, and worked for the city, leveling these fortifications even in the midst of the yellow fever epidemic. United States Marshal John Morrell very quickly figured out that he could make a substantial profit out of these captives. He knew that he was going to be paid for their care by the federal government as long as he had control of them. At the same time, he figured out that he could use large numbers of the captives on his own plantation, Cottingham Plantation in Bryan County to the south of Savannah, where they would produce Sea Island cotton for him, and still, at the same time, while profiting from their labor, charge the United States government for their care. Others who were too small to work on his plantation, he realized he could place in the homes of wealthy Savannahans and get paid slave hire. Even though the captives were not officially slaves, they were being treated as slaves. Across the street lived Richard W. Habersham. Unfortunately, his home is gone now. Habersham was the United States Attorney for Georgia here in Savannah, and he fought for 8 years in the courts to obtain freedom for the captives Morrell profited from.
They were first detained by officers of a survey brig off the coast of Long Island. I can only assume that the charge is murder.
We do hereby claim salvage on the high seas of the Spanish ship La Amistad and all her cargo.
Your Honor, here are the true owners of these slaves.
Most people are familiar with the case of the Amistad, Steven Spielberg movie that came out in 1997. What they don't know from that movie is that John Quincy Adams was involved with the Amistad case from the beginning. He was not reluctant to participate in the case, and in fact his argument before the Supreme Court went on for 2 days, probably a total of more than 7 hours of argument. A third of that argument was devoted to dealing with one case, and that case was the case of the Antelope. There are really two federal legal cases involving the Antelope and the captives of the Antelope. The first was a case for piracy against the captain, a man named John Smith, the prize captain of the Antelope, and the second was a case in admiralty for the value of the Antelope and the value of the captives who were aboard the Antelopes. The 258 living captives that came off the Antelope were worth a fortune. Federal District Court here valued them at $300 apiece, which means a total value in excess of $77,000. If you compare it to its share of the gross domestic product then and took an equal share of the gross domestic product now, this would be in excess of $50 million. If John Smith's a pirate, potentially the captives go back to their original owners, the Spanish and perhaps the Portuguese claimants. If, however, he's a legitimate privateer, there's no question that the captives should be taken by the United States government and returned to freedom in Africa. A privateer is a vessel with a commission from a nation at war, allowing it to make war as a private vessel on the ships or the material of the enemy nation. As long as a privateer only attacks ships of that nation, then what it does is considered legitimate as international law existed in 1820. A pirate was someone who attacks and robs at sea without such a commission, or even a privateer who attacks and robs ships that they are not enemies of. Ultimately, William Wirt, the Attorney General of the United States, is convinced to bring this case before the Supreme Court. It is heard in March of 1825. Despite the small size of the room, apparently more than 200 people packed in for this case, with the famous Francis Scott Key, who was known as one of the greatest attorneys in Washington, D.C., opening arguments for this case. Key, among all of his arguments, in particular focused on what he saw as the central issue here. As he argued, if we had captured a ship loaded with white captives, no one would assume they were slaves. However, because we captured a ship loaded with African captives, people were assuming that those captives were slaves. This was constitutional and moral hypocrisy, he argued. And then he looked at the 6 justices, 4 of whom were slaveholders themselves, and literally he said, by the law of nature, all men are free. He argued for an entire day. This case would continue for 5 days before the Supreme Court. John McPherson Berrien made a very powerful argument contradicting Key, in particular arguing that just because something was natural law did not mean that it was the law of the United States, did not mean that it was international law. And then William Wirt, the Attorney General, closed for the United States. And he told the court that he was not here representing the United States. He was actually here representing the true parties in this case. And those parties were the captives of the Antelope. The captives should be seen not as property whose distribution should be decided by the court, but as human beings, in essence engaged in the equivalent of a habeas corpus petition, asking to be freed from illegal captivity. 2 weeks after the arguments in the Antelope case had finished, John Marshall entered the courtroom and he began to read the decision. After 2 introductory paragraphs, Marshall then, in many ways, turned to the crux of the case. He characterized it as a case in which the sacred rights of property and the sacred rights of freedom were in conflict with one another. And then he went on to say that in deciding such a case at law, we could not allow ourselves to be distracted by sentiment. Probably at that point, both Key and Wirt had some idea that they were not successful in their arguments. In a lengthy opinion, Marshall then goes on to deal with and dismiss the argument that natural law constitutes international law, goes on to dismiss the idea that these are individuals, in essence the equivalent of a habeas corpus petition, and instead concludes that existing positive law is established, usually written law of a jurisdiction, is what compels their decision in this case, and that positive law is that these captives are property, not human beings. I just don't know. I just don't know. The two most important legacies of the Antelope case first involves international law. By not declaring the international slave trade illegal in international law, John Marshall and the United States Supreme Court facilitated the continuance of this trade. From 1825 to 1867, an additional 1,700,000 human beings would be brought from Africa to the New World as slaves. Of those people, more than 10% died during the Middle Passage. So in many ways, you could argue that the Antelope case is responsible for the deaths of more than 170,000 people over the next 30 or so years. As for the principle that property rights supersede the natural rights of human beings, that positive law establishing property rights is the preeminent way to understand the hierarchy of rights. The Antelope decision empowered slaveholders to claim that they had the right to take their slaves anywhere in the Union. If this meant they needed to take their slaves into any Western territory, they argued that because of the primacy of property rights, they could do so. And this growing conflict over the westward expansion of slavery, over slavery in the territories, became a crucial element of the growing national divide over slavery. In many ways, far more than slavery itself, the question of slavery moving into Western territories became the core conflict that would ultimately lead to political dissolution and civil war.
I wasn't actually surprised that the city of Savannah had purchased slaves. I thought that it was interesting how many had actually been purchased, and the fact that there were very few records about where these men lived and what happened to these men when the department was dissolved and at the end of slavery. Looking through the ledgers and seeing individual names that were written on the ledgers of men that were purchased or men that were sold, that is a sad feeling. For me, it was sad. As a historian, it's exciting because you're finding information that is maybe hidden within the record, and now other scholars can find this very easily now and do further research, maybe comparing it to other cities. So that part is fulfilling and exciting. But then from the human aspect, when you see a man's name or a lack of name, it's sad to not see those kind of details or that loss of information, because they were people and you want to tell their story. From the 1830s, I had names for, several enslaved men: Monday, Bob, Chance, Ben. Anytime I saw their names in the record, my eye was drawn to it, and Monday was paid for sawing wood. And the last entry I was able to find for Ben was in 1845 for a pair of pants that were purchased for him. And I saw no more records, and after that, you wonder, what happened to Ben? Where did Ben go? And it's a poignant moment at that point. It is. In the process of discovering this hidden history and helping reveal that hidden history of slavery, municipal slavery in Savannah, has helped broaden my perspective of what kind of work was performed by slaves in the city of Savannah. I've always known that the city was built by slaves, but knowing exactly how the city used slaves to maintain it, I think has broadened my perspective in understanding the history of Savannah.
I wasn't really surprised that the city government was involved in slavery, because everybody was involved in slavery, I think, in some way or another. One of the things I've learned from this project is when I walk out the door and I walk down the street or through one of the squares, is that these individuals helped make that square what it is. So we have, millions of visitors that come to us because of our beautiful city, and a lot of that work comes on the backs of slaves.